Welcome to the Cape Breton Regional Chamber of Commerce panel discussion on the legalization of cannabis and what this ultimately means for our community and your respective businesses. Thank you to each of our panelists today for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us for this very important and interesting discussion on this legislation, which takes effect in just 15 days. So Canada is the second country in the world to legalize the use of marijuana border to border, and the first G7 country to do so. In fact, Uruguay is the only other country in the world that has legalized the recreational use of cannabis. With that being said, I think we can all agree that there is a lot of question around this legalization, especially when it comes to the workplace, implications it has on local businesses, and what steps businesses can take to be prepared. It was important for the Chamber to have this panel discussion today to broaden our understanding of each of these topics. Our Chamber's mission is to empower businesses to thrive. So with that, our goal is for each of you to leave here today better informed about this topic and to feel empowered to take the necessary steps for your businesses. I want to give a big thank you to Jason and Brandon from Seaside Communications. They have generously donated their time to this event today. They've mic'd up each of our panelists so you can each hear them loud and clear. And they'll also be recording the session today as well, so it'll be available after today's event. We're also very lucky to have Wendy Bergfeld host a Main Street Cape Breton on CBC Radio 1 moderate the panel discussion today. Wendy brings more than 3 decades of journalistic experience to her job. She has been a correspondent and field producer for BBC Scotland, a reporter on the prairies, and a current affairs host in the north. She holds an honors bachelor degree from the University of Saskatchewan and an interdisciplinary master's degree from the University of Alberta. And she specializes in community development and communications. Thank you to Wendy and our panelists, to each of you for lending your time and knowledge to this discussion, and thanks for each of you for joining us today. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. I'll leave it to Wendy to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And we have, I just wanted to mention to everyone that we have on the desks, on the tables, some question cards. You'll probably find a few question cards. If during the discussion something comes to mind and you'd like a question put to the panel or a member of the panel, please write it down and just wave it in the air, and somebody will pick it up and bring it up to me, and we'll get that question answered, because I have a feeling that there will be all kinds of questions over the next hour and a half. So let me introduce our guests, and I'll start with the gentleman closest to me, Mr. Tim Pellerin, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation. He came back to Nova Scotia in 2010 to be part of NSLC's executive team. He is responsible for retail store operations and for the evolution of the NSLC brand. He also provides strategic leadership in marketing, merchandising, insights, and corporate social responsibility initiatives. He leads all network strategy and real estate development as well. Just before he joined the NSLC team, he was the Vice President of Marketing for Canada at the Clorox Company, where he led initiatives for brands like Clorox and Glad, Pine Sol, Armor All, and Hidden Valley Ranch. He is a professional wine taster, sommelier, you'll have to teach me how to pronounce that, and holds a WSET diploma designation. And I just wanted to mention that he has another engagement right after this. So if we run over and if you don't get to talk to him in person, we have his business card, and we'll give you his business card and make sure that you have an opportunity to speak with him and ask your question as well. The guest right next to him is Guy LaFosse, who is a trial lawyer. He is renowned for his vast experience before tribunals with mediation and arbitration at all levels of court within the province of Nova Scotia. For 3 decades, his career has focused on civil litigation, insurance defense, criminal defense, and labor law. He graduated from Acadia University in 1971. He immediately began studies at Dalhousie Law School, and after he graduated in 1974, he came home to Cape Breton, where he joined the firm of Boudreau, Beaton, and LaFosse. He was appointed Queen's Counsel and became a managing partner of Stuart McElvey Sterling Scales. In 2000, he became the first lawyer from Cape Breton to be appointed a Fellow of the International Society of Barristers, and he is now the senior partner in LaFosse McLeod. And just next to him, we have Chief McIsaac. And Chief Peter McIsaac from the Cape Breton Regional Police Service was appointed Chief of the Cape Breton Regional Police Service in May of 2001. He began his policing career in '86, worked his way through the ranks with experience on foot patrol, community policing, drug enforcement, homicide investigations, specialized teams, incident command, training, audit, finance, and management of operations. He is a graduate of the Atlantic Police Academy and holds a Bachelor of Technology in Emergency Management from Cape Breton University. He has obtained further education from the Canadian Police College, Henson College, Dalhousie University, and St. Mary's, and he is a subject matter expert for basic investigation skills offered through the Canadian Police Knowledge Network. He is the recipient of the Police Exemplary Service Medal, the Nova Scotia Medal for Police Long Service, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in honor of outstanding contributions to the community, to the province, and to the country. And we welcome Chief McIsaac with us this afternoon. We also have with us Mr. Scott Noss, who is the Senior Director of Inspection and Compliance at Nova Scotia Department of Labour and Advanced Education. He too is a graduate of Dalhousie University, but his degree is in the Chemical Engineering program. He holds a Master's degree in Science and an MBA, and after having held several various safety and managerial positions in both the public and private sector, he went to the Department of Labour and Advanced Education in 2008, and he is now the Senior Director of Inspection and Compliance. And next to him we have Mr. David Burton, who is the co-founder and president, and an experienced litigator, holds degrees in business and law from Acadia and Liverpool universities, respectively. He has assembled the Headland team, which is focused first and foremost on delivering a highly differentiated quality product to the market. It is a fast-growing business, the cannabis market, and the Headland team wants to be sustainable, long-term craft producer that will build a brand in a rapidly developing new world of legal cannabis production and sales, and he is developing his project in Cape Breton. And next to him, I have Patty, who is the Director of Human Resources at Cape Breton University. Before she joined CBU, she was the Manager of Labor Relations at Marine Atlantic. She's been in Human Resources for 10 years, has significant experience in collective bargaining, grievance administration, arbitration, policy development, as well as other areas of HR. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Acadia University and a law degree from the University of New Brunswick. She was called to the bar in 2008, and she is also a chartered professional in human resources. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your panel this morning. So what I thought we would do is we would begin with what you are hearing from your colleagues, from other people in business. What is the biggest concern that you are hearing from individual and business owners and managers? And maybe Patty, I'll start with you.
I think the biggest concern that I've heard is uncertainty around what it's going to mean in workplaces and how many people are going to start using cannabis who maybe don't currently use cannabis. So I think that's probably the biggest concern I've heard is just the uncertainty.
Okay.
Driving would be a big one, driving under the influence and what's being done there to prevent an increase in that. And certainly cannabis in the workplace, ours is not, doesn't escape that issue, and it's something we've all got to address in our workplaces.
What are you hearing?
I'm hearing a lot of concerns from employers around the use in the workplace, and it's kind of unfortunate, but there's kind of a segment of the crowd that really wants to jump into testing, maybe similar to what they have in Alberta, and we're trying to kind of put the brakes on that crowd and letting them know, it starts with an impairment policy and having conversations with your employees and good leadership, and not necessarily jumping to the end of the spectrum.
Actually, I'm not hearing any concerns whatsoever. And I would not be truthful by saying that. I can tell you, I'm hearing all kinds of concerns. I'm hearing concerns from our business community. I'm hearing concerns from the community at large. I'm hearing concerns from our own folks internally. I'm hearing concerns from our elected officials. I'm hearing concerns from our people who control our finances, budgetary stuff. There's all kinds of concerns going on here. And training aspects, I can tell you we've been policing, when there's legislative laws come into effect, we deal with this all the time. Not to this magnitude or this step, but we've been preparing this for the last several months, training our folks. We expect to see a lot of increase in relation to certain types of crime. People are asking that, we're going to see increase in crime. We're expecting to see an increase in capacity on our folks who are on the front lines doing the work every day. There's a lot of concerns that are going forward, though we don't know where this is all going to go. There's been a number of new acts. There's one in the province here, the Nova Scotia Cannabis Control Act, that just came out last week that's going to impact our folks. We're doing all kinds of training there. There's a Smoke-Free Places Act that the province has come up in relation to the legislative that they're put some capacity on that's also going to impact our communities. So there's all kinds of stuff. Each one of them I could talk for many minutes on. So yeah, I'm hearing all kinds of concerns.
Guy, what are you hearing?
A lot of employers that I've been speaking with are concerned about the effects of the legislation with respect to their employees as to if people come in to work impaired, as to what they're going to do with those employees, what rights the employees have, what rights the employers have, etc. I'm also hearing people being concerned about liability issues, that if people are at work and they're using, say the employer is providing drugs to the employees at a party or whatnot, what are the liability issues with respect to those employees and to the employer, and insurance issues that arise out of those matters. Also, I've had people being concerned about if their employees are actually taking cannabis and going out of the country, as to what effect that might have with respect to the seizure of equipment that the employers may have, what effect it may have on the employees as they're trying to go into another country, whether they would be charged, etc. So there's a whole slew of issues that's arising out of this legislation, and that's why we're here today, just to discuss those. Thank you.
Tim, from NSLC's point of view, what are you hearing from people?
I'll nuance my response a bit. I think I'm hearing more confusion than concerns. So maybe absorb that a little bit, because I think as humans, when we have confusion or ambiguity, it leads you to concern with lack of information and knowledge. So I think I agree with most, if not all, my fellow panelists here on the individual items they describe. Anyone around during Y2K? Anyone as old as me? Right? Does it feel a little Y2K-ish, right? Airplanes are going to explode. That's not to minimize that this is one of the biggest things that we'll have seen in our lifetimes in terms of change. And it's not to be taken lightly from policing or corporate social responsibility or employment law, etc. But October 18th will come too. We just have to help each other through this.
Well, maybe Tim, we can start with you on just what exactly is being sold, because I think a lot of us have an idea in our minds what will be sold based on what happened in college dormitories when we were 13 years old.
Sure.
But I'm wondering what we will be seeing.
You notice there's a lawyer between me and someone else right now? I'm in possession already. Yeah, so from a basic form standpoint, we obviously are what people have to remember is all these guidelines from what you will see in NSLC. For a majority of them, they've been set at a federal level. They've been nuanced at a provincial level, cannabis acts, etc., and then they're now being applied within reason of those policies. So you're going to see in our stores dried flower, obviously. So that's something that most people are familiar with. Capsules, product in that form. You'll have seedlings to, as you know, for plants I believe you're allowed to produce at home, depending on the rules of your residence, and oils. So those will be the formats. When you think about the formats, people often ask me the question, will you have medicinal cannabis? And that really is a bit of a red herring question. All medicinal cannabis, it ranges in cannabinoid levels, which are the things you're probably familiar with, THC, CBD. That ranges from no THC at all, that simply is in, certainly there's research that suggests there might be a medical use of that product, no impairment, all the way to probably maxing out between 24 to 26% THC level products, which are pretty strong products that we are going to very much reinforce, go low and slow, and learn how that affects your body along the way. We'll have about 78 or so strains eventually. We learned early that it wasn't necessarily about how much cannabis you have, but how the breadth of assortment you have. And then we'll have formats of pre-rolls, 1 gram, 3.5, 7 gram, and an ounce in a certain amount of those more popular formats.
David, what are you preparing for in terms of product that you want to bring to the market?
So we're very much looking to the next evolution of the products that will be available. We're looking at the vape pens, the edibles that our government has certainly indicated will come online at some point in the future. And obviously the premium dried flower product will be the piece that you hang your hat on.
Why is that?
Is that my mic that's
That
making
might
that
be me.
noise?
I'm not sure.
Because that's where it all starts from. That's what the consumer appreciates. And if it starts with the dried flower, the reputation you build on that dried flower will trickle down into your other products. So the vape pens, et cetera, which with the higher margins, our branding will allow us to, which is built on that premium dried flower product, to trickle down into those basket of goods that include things that aren't yet legal but will be eventually. So we're looking to that next wave.
And Tim, what do we know? What does your market research tell us about who is apt to buy it? Do you have a profile, or do you have some indicators as to who that might be?
Yeah, I think you'd be surprised at how much information we do have. Certainly you see some of it public. We are now working with 13 to 17 different vendors who have, from a licensed producer standpoint, a license to sell. And so they're trying to find out who their consumer is going to be as well. Just to bucket a few coin terms that I've heard, there's the loyal user today, who's today has a illegal source and may continue with that or may move to us over time, knowing that they can get a consistent, safe product. You have an interesting term called the boomerang consumer, someone that might be 43-ish years of age who hasn't consumed cannabis for 20 years and since university, but wasn't wanting to be part of an illegal system or have access or feel comfortable with it, who might come into our stores and be thinking about buying a bottle of wine and say, hey, honey, maybe a little something different this night. It's been a while that we've had that. Happy anniversary. And I think those are kind of the two spectrums. I think the other thing we've learned in the research we've seen is it's a very occasion-based product. So we talk about occasions a lot. One of our mottos is make life a social occasion and celebrating life's occasions. And if you look at the different moments in your life where you might try it or consume it, there's this group friend activity where you might not be the person to go buy it, you might not be the person even that interested, but when put in that setting with a product that's known now, generally how it should affect you or has affected others, you might be a little bit more open to trying that than you were in the past. So we have many different outlooks on who our consumer will be.
Is there a lot of interest at the moment? Like, are you answering a lot of questions? Is your phone ringing all the time? Is this something that people are talking about?
Yeah, we were busy before. We didn't necessarily, ask for this mandate, but we're very proud that our shareholder has decided that, at least for the start, we'll be the sole retailer of cannabis in Nova Scotia. I am literally getting inquiries from Fortune 500 company CEOs from around the world, Diageo, InBev, these things you hear about that have these multi-billion-dollar market caps, because we are unique, that we are pioneering the co-location of beverage alcohol and cannabis in one physical location of anywhere in the world. Now we have the appropriate controls in between, 19 only and to access. You can't view product. If you've anyone been to Sydney River Store lately and seen kind of what's going on in the back left corner, we had some media there today, so you'll probably see some stuff on the local news today. But we are a petri dish of experimentation for the world, and that comes with a huge responsibility from a retailing and a corporate social responsibility standpoint. So yeah, we're hearing lots of confusion, lots of operating standards on how we sell beverage alcohol that have to be tweaked and nuanced, and we have a re-education of our consumer. You can imagine just one quick one I'll go through, being 19 to have to go in there. I take my two daughters into our stores if I'm, buying a bottle of wine. They're certainly not allowed to interact with the product or touch it or experience it in any way. But, and I'm not trying to normalize them, but I'm also not trying to make them afraid of beverage alcohol. I can't leave them outside the door when I go in to get my cannabis. My people are not going to be, babysitting, nor is it appropriate. And, I think little things like that are worrying my 1,350 people of what if that person comes back in 5 minutes and their kids aren't there and they knew there wasn't someone else watching them, right? Could that person have just take them to their car and said, be back in 5-10 minutes? So we just hope to reinforce that through our partnership with law enforcement, and through just good common sense, Nova Scotians will learn how this new behavior is expected in our stores.
Peter, what do you see? Like when you look at the potential users, what do you see as some points that would come to your interest in the police service?
Well, the consumption of cannabis is not really something new that we've seen before. My concern is basically that when we legalize it, we basically normalize it. We don't really have a lot of data to go by in relation to another country around the globe that's done this sort of thing. You mentioned Uruguay. That's the only other country that has basically passed recreational use of cannabis. But we can look at the data in relation to Colorado and Washington states, and a lot of the data there will tell you that there will be an increase in the amount of motor vehicle accidents, personal injuries, increase in fatalities. The impaired driving offenses are probably going to go up. No different than in relation to what alcohol has done. So from a public safety perspective, as the police chief and as the enforcement for public safety in the area here, that is something that concerns me, to ensure that our folks do have the proper training, the proper communication and messaging go out there, that when people do this stuff, that they do it safely. And from a public safety perspective, like I said, you've got to look at past practices and best practices, and the data will tell you. So I think we can expect an increase in that, and that is concerning.
Okay. I'm going to ask the same question to Scott, Patty, and Guy, but in sort of different ways. I'm going to start with you, Scott. What should employers be concerned about? What is the single biggest risk facing employers under this new legislation?
Well, I think really it comes down, employers need to know their people. They need to know, when their people are behaving normally and maybe when they're off, okay, or impaired. And impairment due to cannabis is no different from impairment maybe due to other illicit drugs, prescription drugs, or even fatigue, for instance. So I think it's really critical that employers, continue to take that time and spend their time with their employees and really are aware of their actions or behaviors and making sure that they are safe and fit for work.
So, Patty, what in an institution like CBU, for instance, or an institution that has a wide variety of people, what would your concerns be?
I think, again, it goes back to safety and making sure that all of your policies are updated and prepared to address any safety concerns that you may have in the workplace. Every employer has requirements under the occupational health and safety legislation, and any policies that you develop. It's not specific to cannabis, it's not specific to alcohol. It's making sure that it's up to date and all the rules related to the safety requirements in the workplace are well known to employees.
So what, Guy, would you say people should be aware of?
There are a lot of issues under for the employers, under the Human Rights Act, both provincial and federal, that there is a definition that says that if somebody is impaired by alcohol or drugs, and if they have an addiction, then you can't discriminate against an individual who has those addictions. And under the Human Rights Act, both provincially and federally, there is an obligation and a duty on the employer to be able to accommodate those employees. Now, it depends on the type of industry that an employer has too. if you're into a high-risk type of industry, it could be, for example, the oil sands or something like that where you've got heavy equipment operators, as opposed to someone who's in, say, a law office and with a secretary or whoever would be doing the work, that there's a heavier onus on the employer to make sure that somebody who's in a safety-sensitive position, such as a heavy equipment operator, is not using any type of cannabis or alcohol. So that's a real concern there. The other concern that I have when I look at the Cannabis Act, which is only 137 pages long, so it's great bedtime reading for anybody who really wants to enjoy that. But you know, when I look at some of the finer details of that act, and in particular the definition of distribution, what it includes is the definition of giving, possessing, and transporting. Now that may not mean a lot to you, but I remember in my previous life as a federal drug prosecutor doing a prosecution of an individual who was actually giving drugs to another person, and he was charged in that instance with trafficking and was convicted in a jury trial. So I'm envisioning a situation that the happy hours on Fridays at some businesses may take on a whole new connotation, with employers possibly providing cannabis to employees, etc. And so if you get into the strict definition of give within the meaning of the Cannabis Act, then you're in violation of that. Now, I can't imagine Peter having his police officers going out doing a search warrant and things like that, but it may very well happen. And if you're actually charged with that under the Cannabis Act, the maximum penalty is 14 years in jail. It's very, very strict. And you also get to the stage that if you're transporting, so if you have, for example, a trucking business, and you have employees who are actually transporting equipment and or goods, and let's say they're going into the States and they happen to have some cannabis on them legally acquired in Nova Scotia, it may not be the same, certainly in most of the states in the United States. And not only can that person be charged with importing drugs, but the equipment, the trucks, the equipment, all the goods can be seized as well. And so it creates quite a hardship for employers in that instance. You also get into liability issues, so that if you go back to the happy hour cannabis party at the employer's office, and the employer has got an obligation to make sure that employees aren't going out and driving. So if they happen to go out and drive and get into a significant accident where they're injured, or they could be causing somebody else to be injured, you get into host liability issues with respect to what are the liability factors that come into play for the employer. You also get into some very significant insurance issues, because if somebody is actually under the influence, as to whether or not there is then coverage under that policy. So those are the types of things that are arising out of this legislation that employers really have a look at. Those are just a few.
So David, you are running a business. I mean, but you were also civil litigator before you did this. How are you setting up your policy? How are you thinking through all of these eventualities?
It's been a steep learning curve for me, but I was very fortunate to get in bed with a consultant out of Southern Ontario, a Danish growing specialist who's since been acquired by Aurora Cannabis. And the first thing this long in the tooth grower told me was the number one mistake I'm seeing proponents make, aspiring producers make, is not getting into HR early enough, developing their policies before they've even got a single employee on the books. And he described that as the biggest pitfall that he's seen the companies he's working with make. So we came back to Nova Scotia with that information and immediately got a very senior lady into the management team, Colleen Alexander, who's been in HR for decades, to lead us in that regard.
What could go wrong? How is it a pitfall for people?
In the workplace, being
Yeah, like
inebriated in the workplace?
if your HR policies don't reflect the new reality, what's at risk?
alienating your employees, getting into a situation where you have employees that, again, it's about information. If they are unaware of where the boundaries are set, they're more likely to go over those boundaries. And how do you recover from that? So if at the outset you're prepared, you have the voluminous policies of many different shapes in place, then at least the lines are drawn, and then it's about training to ensure that every employee, top to bottom, understands where the lines have been drawn.
And where are the lines? Maybe give me an example of where you've decided in your firm that the lines are going to be.
We ideally wouldn't like to see people coming to work inebriated or becoming inebriated while at work. That being said, employees in this new dawn have employee rights, as all employees across Canada have. But some of our frontline staff have come from an environment where they're not cognizant as employers or agents of the employer in management positions of the rights that those working underneath them and reporting to them have. So perhaps in my industry, in the production side, it's almost more of an acute problem because you have people in positions of management that need tremendous training and assistance to be the managers you want them to be in this new legal framework that we live in.
In Cape Breton University, there are different cohorts of people, all with different responsibilities, different fields of interest, different connections to the institution. Will one HR policy cover? I'm just trying to figure out where you are right now. It seems overwhelming.
I think there are a lot of things to take into consideration when you're looking at a policy for an organization, and it really depends on what your business is. I can speak about Cape Breton University. We've looked at, I can't even remember how many, 10 or 12 different documents that require updating for the new legislation that's going to be introduced. And there's a variety of legislation that you need to take into consideration when you're building your policies. Occupational health and safety legislation, human rights legislation, Smoke-Free Places Act, the Cannabis Act, the Cannabis for Medical Purposes Act. There are a variety of issues to look at, and I would say that it's not a case where one policy fits all. You have to take into consideration, do you serve customers? In our case, we have students, which needs to be considered. What are going to be the rules for your employees? How are you going to accommodate an employee who's using cannabis for medical purposes? It's really important to consult with everybody in the organization to find out what policies do you need to update and what are the rules that are going to work for your organization. And I would use the Smoke-Free Places Act as an example. It sets out the minimum distance from a door that you can use cannabis, but is that going to be appropriate for your organization? It really depends on what type of a business you run, and that sets out the minimum standard, but that doesn't mean that the policy for your organization needs to line up with that legislation.
What about, Scott, performance and productivity and safety? I mean, can you think of policies and ways that people have drafted them that apply specifically to cannabis? Because isn't it one of those things that stays in your system for a period of time? You can pick it up long after the effects have sort of passed out of your consciousness?
Yeah, so we're recommending that employers look at it globally from an impairment standpoint, not necessarily singling out any one particular drugs, because the dynamic can change in that situation. I think looking at it holistically across the board is probably the best approach. I've heard it pointed out by one of my fellow panelists here today that you'll want to look at the individual jobs and the individual tasks in some of these jobs and determine some I guess we're calling them safety-sensitive positions or duties. Operating motor vehicles, maybe operating heavy equipment, chainsaws. It'll state right in the manufacturer specs. Do not operate this device under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So you're really going to have to, as an employer, kind of focus more on the task than necessarily the type of impairment. If that makes sense.
I was going to, yeah, if you want, yeah.
I think one of the biggest misnomers, and I think it's important to clear, and it's a reason why it's even harder. I hate to put it out there for you. Is it's actually quite the opposite in that, we generally have learned that if you consume beverage alcohol, don't drink and drive. Wait till the next morning. Arguably, we see many instances of morning impairment. Even if you've finished consuming at 3 a.m. and you're driving home at 7 or 8, we've heard that's certainly an emerging area. Cannabis acts very differently. If cannabis is ingested through your lungs, you can legally blow over some of the limits that are going to be out there, at least in Canada or have in the world, in 6 to 8 hours. So we were working with MAD Canada. We have to nuance our communication because we can't just say, don't drive till the next morning or don't do whatever. When edibles comes into play, you begin to ingest that and it's actually absorbed through the liver, and that can stay with you for double the time. So there's a whole new understanding we have to give people as early as a year from now, which is on legislation that has to be legal within a year from a federal standpoint, and we're going to have to recondition consumers again. So, and then you multiply it that 100% CBD product is there's no psychological impairment in arguably. So I heard the word accommodation here earlier. That has to happen today. If someone has a medical script, they have a duty to declare to you, and then to accommodate them accordingly. So, what I would just comment on all the policy questions. I think everyone knows. The NSLC is one of the biggest employers in Nova Scotia. We've got everything from forklift operators to marketers, and we're on both sides of this, and we're the one retailer of selling cannabis. So, all I would say is if you don't have these policies in place already, and you're just improving them and bringing greater awareness to them and greater depth and greater, maybe nuance to role specific, you are years behind to start. We are the highest per capita consumption of cannabis, medical cannabis in Canada. We're the second highest per capita consumption of cannabis overall in Canada, only behind BC. Pause for effect, right? A lot of people smoking weed in Canada, in Nova Scotia, right? And that's to our friends to the right here. It's only going to probably get more as access and convenience and understanding and knowledge gets bigger. And you hear some of the stats out of Colorado, for instance. They're grossly underestimated on how many folks are caught consuming cannabis and driving because the standard's so high for you to prove it in court. So they go for the alcohol charge, right? And so you hear 10, 5, 15, depending on the number. I would argue it's probably double that, right? And so we all have to be sensitive to educating people how to consume this responsibly.
I am curious, though, about a new cohort of people consuming. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to interview a gentleman who works for Canada Health, who was wondering about senior citizens and drug interactions, because when you're 18 and you're experimenting, you're not on a high blood pressure pill, you're not on Lipitor. Chances are you're not taking any of those medications that you take when you get to a certain point in your life. What about that cohort of people that has never done this before, has no idea how it's going to work for them? I mean, what are we expecting socially around that?
Well, do you want me to try that?
Yeah.
I have a 78-year-old mom, and when she heard what I was about to do, it was an interesting conversation. And she's got a handful of different pills that she takes for her arthritis and many other things. I think the one thing, I've gone through the 5 stages. I'm at acceptance now that this is going to happen to us all on October 17th. Some of you are probably at different stages of denial and different things, and welcome and get there quick with me. I think the one thing I can say is if you do any of the literature, legalizing this will at least allow a lot of this research to happen. And will allow legitimate health professionals to understand if this helps someone get their appetite back when they're on chemotherapy, if this helps inflammation, and again, all if done properly with the right controls and medical, doctor initiated. So I'm hopeful on that for my daughters and for the future. I think in the meantime, though, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of unknowns that ultimately this is something you're ingesting and creating a personal experience through. And we're not going to give any medical advice to anyone, and we would encourage everyone to go see their doctor and attempt to get a as best opinion as they can from a professional.
Are you?
I'd like to comment on that, particularly with respect to the social effects, because one of the concerns that I have is that when I saw, for example, the casinos coming to Sydney, a lot of people who would not necessarily have had easy access to gambling suddenly had it in Sydney. And let me tell you, from my practice, I saw a lot of really good people getting addicted to gambling and ending up going bankrupt, going out committing criminal offenses so they could feed their habit to gamble, and basically destroying their lives and their whole families. So one of the concerns I have with respect to the legalization of it is that people who haven't been using it, and it's the analogy with the gambling, are now going to start to use that. And they may start to get really addicted, they may get into heavier drugs, and the social implications of that can be fairly significant. And, you know, when we look at our medical system, to be able to go to a doctor, you're lucky if you can get to see one in many respects, so that it's going to be very difficult once we see the ramifications of that. And Peter and his police force are going to see more people being charged criminally. There are going to be a lot more automobile accidents. There's going to be a lot more fallout from this, domestic relations, etc. And it's part of the easy access to it. And that's one of the things that we can see. And it's going to create issues with respect to our healthcare system. It's going to create all kinds of issues in our justice system. But, you know, that's part of the future.
I have to comment. So, I am not a cannabis advocate. I'm socially liberal, fiscally conservative. I don't even have a political slant. So, all I would say is I think you just have to look at it on the broader whole. I think very fair points. I think addiction can happen in many different ways in different areas. But I know someone who's sitting right over there too, who sees the funds that are going to organized crime. That you could argue a whole list that if the true intent of this policy comes anywhere close to what Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Blair say to us, then it should hopefully should be on balance a better thing for Canadians. And I don't know that answer, but I would just say it's a much bigger picture than a very legitimate concern that we have on beverage alcohol every day, that we have on other sins in life or vices. But I think it's a bigger assessment.
It's a fair points there. But I would just say in relation to Mr. Blair, when I sat on the national board of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and he was our president, he would have a different viewpoint then than he does now. So just make it. And in the addiction part, and you're right. In relation to cannabis, like, people think of me in my position that I'm totally against cannabis being legalized, and actually I'm not, because the actual substance itself is going to be more regulated. It's going to take it out of the hands of criminals to a certain aspect. We'll never get rid of black market stuff totally. I think it makes it more safe in relation to how it's growing, the substance, the chemicals that are in it. I think it makes it more safe in a lot of ways. I know one of the major platforms with the government and the legislation was, well, keep it in the hands of young people. And for me, one of my biggest concerns is, well, we really didn't do that, because when we decided that we were going to put 4 plants in each household, well, we really didn't take it in the hands of young people. We actually put it in the hands of young people. So that concerns me. And when you hear the researchers like I'm looking at Beth down there, Dr. Phil Tebow, and who's been researching this stuff at the Dalhousie University for years, and he talks about the developing young brain up to age 25. They're suggesting even longer now, age-wise, that the impacts it has on young people, that scares the hell out of me where we're going to go with this stuff, right? And we know Canada, as far as young people go, young people in Canada are some of the biggest consumers of cannabis on this planet. And you heard me say it before, that when we legalize it, we normalize it, and then we kind of put it in the hands of young people. I'm really hoping that someone's going to really track the data, and I'm hoping not we're going to make the same mistakes that we made with alcohol in 20 years' time and say, what the hell did we do?
I think one point in that's really fair is, dried flower is just the start. I think, form drives consumption too. How many people in the room either hate smoking or haven't smoked for many years, etc. There's a big barrier to entry, that first phase. That second phase, when form makes it easier, vaping and edible, I think it opens up that challenge even more broadly, because that audience can be that much bigger. I will say that I've seen, and maybe you're better to comment, much research that shows aspects of violent crime when consumers, though, do move from beverage alcohol to cannabis, that there's actually some improvement in that.
Hey, listen, I'm an advocate for the municipal alcohol policy around here because of my almost 35 years of policing. If you go back and you drill down, alcohol has the biggest significant impact on crime and social issues within our community. My only concern is about the cannabis aspect, and I really hope we have some really common sense, and as this thing goes along, that we make some adjustments, that we don't make the same mistakes with alcohol, because it has a significant impact on not only public safety and policing, the healthcare system, our social norms. Beth can comment more on it more than I can, because she lives this stuff, but I really see it. I know when we went back, we were doing the municipal alcohol policy, and there's a lot of correlations with cannabis there. We never really had the data to say, what impacts on the number of police calls that we get that involves alcohol? Well, when we drilled out, we randomly picked 100 files, and we found out that there was well over 70% of the issues that we were dealing with crime were, root cause was alcohol. And my only concern is, are we going to be in the same position when cannabis becomes normalized and legalized, and we have more people consuming it? It's a substance.
Wendy, if I may ask a question, that's kicked off a healthy debate, and I appreciate the concerns of the side that are worried about increased consumption and normalization of use. But the reality is before legalization, we've got this statistic that says 1 in 5 Nova Scotians uses the product. And your question was about the medical community being able to intelligently and in an informed manner answer questions from their patients. And the reality is those medical practitioners don't have the body of research on which to properly answer those questions. So to be willfully blind and not allow that research to happen, it's a disservice to the 20% of Nova Scotians who are already using cannabis, and the 80% of the majority are just got the blinders on, pretending it isn't happening, and the answers that your medical question was driving at will never come. But in this new world order, we're going to see medical practitioners who are now informed, and the research that has needed to happen for decades finally start to happen and provide those medical practitioners with the results they need to properly advise their patients.
Well, Patty, from a workplace standpoint, can cannabis be managed in much the same way that alcohol is, and that is around social expectations? If somebody has a beer over lunch and then comes back to work, and you smell beer on their breath, you think somewhat less of it. I mean, I think we do. So there's sort of a social containment in the workplace around that workplaces develop their own culture of what's acceptable within the workplace. Talk to me about that workplace culture, and is cannabis use evolve in the same way that alcohol use has evolved in some corporate cultures?
I think it really depends on the organization and the tolerance for alcohol. So if you work in a very safety-sensitive environment, there's low tolerance for alcohol, whereas if it's a low safety-sensitive environment, there may be the ability to consume alcohol during a lunch break. It really depends on the employer's policy. The challenge with cannabis is that there's still a stigma attached with cannabis at this point, and I think as time goes on, some of that stigma may go away, and it'll become more of the norm. And that's where I think employers really need to turn their minds to what is the expectation around cannabis? What is reasonable for employees to expect? What do you expect from employees? And the important thing to focus on is communication and education with employees, so that there's no misunderstanding about what the rules in the workplace are for your specific workplace. So open up those lines of communications and develop the policies that make sense for your organization. And I would say it's important not to assume that people are going to act reasonably and exercise good judgment. So I've heard a lot of people say that most people know that they can't come to work under the influence of alcohol, so it's going to be the same thing with cannabis. You'd be surprised how many people you talk to who think that as soon as it becomes legal, well, there's nothing the employer can do. I'm entitled to use it. And it's the same with cannabis for medical purposes. People assume if they have an authorization that they can use cannabis wherever they want to and whenever they want to, which is not the case. It really depends on the policies and the rules in place at the workplace.
Policies, because we're going through that right now with the CBRM. I know Guy makes some good references here, and you made some references as well too, right? You need individual policies for your own organization. I know the CBRM is developing overall policy with regards to the things that you talked about in relation to addiction is an illness and a sickness, and there's certain obligations on the employer to provide accommodations and put things in place to support people in the workplace, right? However, the police organization itself, we just about got a policy developed internally that we are going to initiate within our own organization. I'm getting some pushback because the CBRM thinks that we should have one encompassing policy. Well, I'm saying no, because all our departments are different, and policing is certainly different in the public safety aspect. You think about the duties that a police officer performs every day and the amount of decisions they make, then sometimes involve life and death. And the other thing is we carry firearms. We have people on specialized teams who carry big guns and make big decisions on certain aspects. So we're trying to develop a policy in relation to the things that you talked about, impairment and coming to work and the expectations. But we're also governed under the Police Act where you cannot consume alcohol or any other type of drugs other than prescribed if it impairs your ability to perform on your job function. But it's not that simple. Calgary Police Service just last week issued a policy basically saying anyone carrying a firearm, both on and off duty, cannot consume cannabis. And I'm like saying, okay, well, hold on. Now, there's a legislative law in place. There's internal policy. Does the internal policy outweigh the legislative law? I'll digress to you, legal counsel.
It's going to be a field day for lawyers.
So it's funny. We have a meeting tomorrow, and we got our legal people, our HR people involved, and I'm very lucky that I sat on the Human Relations Committee for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and we've had some people researching, and they had a whole bunch of entities come together over the last 6 months, and we think we've got a really good policy in place in relation to the expectation that you can't be impaired when you come to work, no matter what your job is. And you can say a police officer carrying a gun, but I also made the reference to you earlier, Guy, when I said, well, risk and job function is all relevant to the position. I said, what about the guy in public works who's putting the lug nuts on a police vehicle that's going to be involved in a high-speed chase in 3 hours' time? When he's impaired putting the lug nuts on, the wheel's going to fall off. So there's really no difference when you compare it all. So that's some of the things that we're trying to work out, and it's complicated.
Well, let me,
Ben, if I could just talk with the culture in a workplace, because it's really incumbent upon employers not to create a culture where the use of drugs and alcohol is the norm. Let me give you an example of where that happened, and it's an unusual example. It was probably, 20, 25 years ago, not to age myself too much, that I was defending this RCMP officer who was an undercover agent. And part of the task that he had as an undercover agent was to go in and become part of the group that was selling drugs. And so a lot of time was spent in taverns and various other places. And so what happened after a while, he became addicted to alcohol, okay? So the culture back in the RCMP barracks in Sydney, as an example at that time, is that when there was a big roundup of one of these drug busts, that what would happen is that the officers involved would go back to the detachment, and there was a bar there, and you were expected to drink. That's the culture. So this guy got really addicted to alcohol, both through the work and at the workplace. And he was married at the time. It's a sad and interesting story at the same time, but he was having an affair with this lady, and this lady was having an affair with her employer. So my client was upset because the lady that he was having the affair with was having an affair with her employer. So
I'm confused.
So he went out and he slashed the tires of the girlfriend's car and the employer's car. He ends up getting charged criminally. So because of the addiction issues and the professional people that I was able to bring in, and because of the references that he had, he was able to get an absolute discharge in the circumstances. It didn't end there. The RCMP then had a hearing to see whether they would fire him. They brought in a special panel from Ottawa, and so I was representing him at that particular hearing. But before the hearing, I was doing a lot of research and found out about the culture within the RCMP, how the RCMP had encouraged its employees to go back to the bar after the drug bust, and they had a number of studies conducted which indicated that, look, this is part of the culture. People are becoming addicted to drugs, they're becoming addicted to alcohol, and that's something as an obligation as an employer you should be looking at. So in that particular hearing, we got into those matters and brought those issues up. So at the end of the day, this fellow wasn't dismissed, and in fact, they put him on a rehabilitation program, and he then started working with other officers who were having the same problem. So I suppose the lesson that at least I learned out of that is that from the employer's perspective, you really had to be very circumspect as to what you're condoning in terms of what's happening in your office. Because if you're condoning a culture of drug addiction or alcoholism, well, there's a major fallout for that, and you may very well end up being responsible, because I can see in that instance where the employee can turn around and potentially sue the employer. Okay? So an employer certainly has to be very careful as to what the atmosphere is around the office and what the policies are. A lot of companies have policies now that you can't drink on the job, or you can't be coming in. But you should extend those certainly to the use of drugs as well.
But what about the employee's duty to disclose? And I'm looking around the room, and I see people who are involved in the theater community and the entertainment community, and we've all been in the situation where you're up on stage and the guy that's on the lights maybe has had a drink or two, or maybe he went out into the parking lot and there's a little bit of blue smoke around him, and those cues just aren't coming there. Do you have the right to ask him, have you been using? And what is his obligation to disclose? Do you have the right to ask that question, and should he disclose? And if so, can you take steps? Because that goes to how do you know, and when do you act? I'm going to ask you, Patty.
I would say it depends. That's the answer to everything. It really depends. The disclosure requirements really depend on the workplace and what you've established as the rules for employees. And it should be clearly defined for employees when medications or when drug use has to be disclosed and when it doesn't have to be disclosed. If you're talking about the use of medical cannabis, I think it's really important to remember what it is that you're accommodating in the workplace, and it's the underlying disability is what is required to be accommodated, not necessarily the cannabis. So in that case, it's really important to establish what the rules and the procedures are around getting information from the employee about what the underlying disability is and what that process is for requesting accommodation. In terms of recreational use of cannabis and disclosing that, it really depends on what you're observing in the workplace. I would say if you see somebody who is behaving in a manner that seems out of the norm, you're absolutely within your rights to ask the employee what's going on. But you can't necessarily assume that it's cannabis related. So it becomes really complicated, and the best thing to do is establish good education for managers so that they understand what to do in those circumstances, what questions to ask. So you don't necessarily have to assume that the person is under the influence of cannabis, but you can start that investigation to find out what's happening with the person in the circumstances, and do some investigation to figure out what the next steps are, whether it's testing, if you do that in your workplace, or if you need to take the person out of service. It could be something completely unrelated to substances where they need medical attention. So I think it really depends on the circumstances.
Scott, are there protocols that you can that are off the shelf that can help people answer the question, when is somebody impaired and when do you act?
Well, my department obviously isn't experts on impairment, but any time that an employee feels that another employee is a hazard to them, they have the obligation to actually report this hazard to the employer, and the employer has to investigate at that point. And again, the employer knows the employee, knows how they behave under normal circumstances, and if they have reason to believe that they're impaired, well, they need to then begin to look. And again, Patty alluded to this. It's going to be very situational dependent. It's going to be very different if this person's operating a piece of heavy equipment versus delivering mail in an office. So, the situation will have to be examined, the person, how they're behaving, they obviously have to have a discussion with the employee, and then from there, the employer's responsible to come up with a safe means to ensure that everybody at the workplace is safe.
Tim?
No, I was just going to say there's a lot of powerful points I think made, and I think what it's reinforcing to the room, unfortunately, is how hard it is to be just black and white, determine any situation in this. You can imagine we have the same situation with our employees, but we also have to ensure we don't serve impaired customers. So, for law enforcement, the analogy I'm giving my employees is this is beverage alcohol before the roadside test, before breathalyzers, right? And believe it or not, breathalyzers are only around for 30 or 40 years. I remember the anniversary came 62. Yeah, it's not hundreds of years, obviously, and so for these guys and a small degree us, it's back to a protocol to determine a reasonable standard of whether that person is impaired or not. Because we're talking cannabis today, but I think you're hearing the word impaired about 500 times out of us. And if you take that I love the analogy earlier, but to fatigue, right? Like we have forklift operators, our folks in our store operate, pallet jacks and forklifts. There's many different ways you can be impaired. So if you think of it from impairment and you think about how you determine impairment, I think it's a really powerful way to look at it.
I just wanted to know, are there any questions in the room? Does anybody have anything that they would like to see covered? If you want to write that question on your card, and we'll bring them up and have a look at your question. But one of the sort of the broader sort of themes I'm hearing sort of swirling in the air is still this issue of stigma. There's still stigma associated. Well, there's stigma associated with alcohol use in some offices, but certainly stigma around the use of cannabis. And I'm wondering about managing that. Because you can see very quickly how offices can divide among the users and the non-users in the way that sort of the smoker-non-smoker discussion took place. People who remember the 80s and sort of the tensions around that. So what advice would you give? Maybe I'll start with you about sort of managing the stigma and the natural human sort of sense of judging one another, I suppose.
Yeah. I'd hate to say this, but I'll piggyback on something. I think we're one generation away from a lot of those going away. I think we'll see normalization happen quicker than any of us are comfortable with. I think the approach from our federal government and provincial government has put a bunch of tight restrictions because you can always let them get looser. It's hard to make them tighter. So you're going to see that probably multiply a bit. But, we have a culture that we don't, we really try to root out bullying in our culture. It is something prevalent, whether you're 60 years old or 16. That happens in many corporate cultures. We're not going to, we don't have a particular plan against it, to counter it, but it will be legal. So we have to, look at it like another product, a controlled substance that has a bunch of slightly different rules to it, and we'll kind of take it from there. But yeah, I'd say we have no proactive plan, but we'll certainly be sensitive to anyone who's ostracized accordingly for any reason.
Guy, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think one of the big things is communication within an office, that it's a matter of sitting down with employees and discussing what the situation is, reviewing the policies, making people aware of the policies, and having a comfort level. But I agree that I think in time, the use of cannabis is just going to become very accepted and very normal, and it'll be part of the workplace. But in the interim, it's a matter of communication and getting people online with what's happening in the workplace.
Yeah.
On that, I'm not sure that legalization is necessarily going to address or drown out the stigma point that you raised. If you look at tobacco users are more stigmatized today than they were 40 years ago. So I'm not sure that's the case, but the polarization in our society is a growing problem, and it's not just with respect to cannabis or tobacco, but all things, and we just need to be a more understanding society.
He made there too about we're one generation away, and unfortunately, I think you and I are that generation that got to get out of the way. Not that I want to go anywhere, but I think you're correct. Like I know from speaking to the doctors that have researched this stuff, like the young people. When I say young people that have been around cannabis or made cannabis part of their life, and I'm talking teenagers or people in their 20s and 30s that have been doing this stuff for a while. They see this stuff as naturally occurring. They just view it as a plant. They can give you all kinds of reasons why they think it's good for them. It lowers their anxiety, makes them feel better, save me from suicide. And no matter what evidence you put in front of them to say that the contrary, that there's issues with this. And I agree, there's got to be a lot more research because we really don't know the overall effects, good or bad, with it. I think that whole generation the stigma is going to drop there. but you make a really good point as well in relation to policies and that. I think we need some really good, strong policies in relation to stigma, so everybody knows the guiding principles and the rules of engagement, so that we're all move forward and everybody understands this stuff. And I think in time, a lot of it will probably take care of itself.
I have a couple of questions from the floor. And actually, this is one that I bet a lot of us don't know. How do you test impairment? How do you know if somebody is impaired? Is there a roadside test?
Well, there is,
Okay.
but there's more than the roadside test. That's a great question, by the way. That's a wonderful question. So a lot of people don't realize is when Bill C-45 came in about the legalization and legislation for cannabis, there was also another bill that came in the past, was Bill C-46. And that was the amendment to the criminal code in relation to impaired driving. And the laws all changed or in regards to impaired driving going forward after this. Actually, they're a law now. And one of the big things, and I know the lawyers are going to have issue with this, is when in the old legislation, the police needed reasonable probable grounds and needed the evidence to support that somebody was impaired by then alcohol or drugs. And by that I mean that there had to be some type of physical evidence, whether driving the car with a radic over the center line or weaving left of center, whatever it was. When they approached the vehicle, the individual had reddish bloodshot eyes, odor of alcohol, or had muscle coordination, was fumbling with their papers, unsteady on their feet. And that would form the reasonable probable grounds for a police officer to believe that someone was impaired by alcohol or drugs, and they would arrest them and read them demand. Now, with the new legislation, all we need now is reasonable suspicion. So what's reasonable suspicion? It's open for a wide definition. For me, all I got to say was, he talked funny. He drove funny.
But what's happening? I was at a seminar recently, and one of the prosecutors was making the point that for impairment, that the police officers really have to do, I think there's about 7 series of examinations that they have to go through to really make a determination as to whether they think the person could be impaired by drugs. And so I know Peter's got a number of officers who are going for special training to be able to detect that, and you really had to be qualified to be able to detect that. And that's one of the real issues, is that how do you determine and detect whether somebody is actually under the influence? And that's certainly a major issue with respect to employers.
And he's right there. So I'll finish. So a lot of things haven't changed, but some things have changed. With regards to a police officer now under Bill C-46, all I need is a reasonable suspicion. Well, that makes it a very, very broad definition for me and gives me, a police officer, a lot of latitude. But basically, you need the evidence to support placing someone under arrest or detaining them. And all those things I mentioned earlier, you would have to need them. Also, our officers are trained what they call standard field sobriety testing. That came out a number of years ago. In relation to it's a predefined series of tests that we put an individual through that's been accepted by the court in relation to what the officer does to form the grounds that someone is impaired. Now, alcohol is a little different because you can smell it, but cannabis or other drugs is not so easy to detect. You need the physical evidence to support that. And one of the things that we've had, and there's nothing new here again as well, we have drug recognition evaluation officers who have been around maybe 5 or 6 years. And these are highly trained officers that go through a whole series of training. Matter of fact, they're trained abroad internationally in Phoenix, Arizona. And it's not for every officer. You need someone who's really, really astute and a good academic student. And they come back, and it's a whole process. And recently, up about maybe a year or two ago, those evaluations and those testings have been accepted by the court in Canada here. And I know, you heard me talk when I give my opening statement here, we've been training our officers in this regard for the last number of years. With the legalization of cannabis coming forward, we've increased, every officer in our organization is being trained in standard field sobriety test. I've just actually sent 5 officers away who just graduated last week in relation to Phoenix, Arizona, being drug recognition evaluation officers. Train the trainer, they're going to come back and train some more folks here. So I have more capacity because we think the numbers are going to increase, and I need people ready to deal with this stuff when it happens.
I have about 3 questions that are around the nature of the cannabis. One question has to do with sort of the fundamental differences between strains and varieties, and whether or not you can tell whether Nova Scotians are ingesting cannabis that is legal or illegal. Is there a way to tell whether this has been legally purchased? There's no difference in the product. It's just There's no way.
Well,
There's no way to know.
I would say this. I mean, organized crime are sophisticated organizations, and upon legalization, they need to continue to try to maintain their revenue, and so the only thing they can do to, in some ways, compete in cannabis is to drive price down. And to drive price down, I would be very concerned after October 17th of what goes into that product, the nature of that product, to both in cannabis as well as in much more stronger, more illicit drugs. So that scares me. But in terms of the product itself, no. I mean, think about, from a return standpoint, we're going to take returns of the product, but only during certain circumstances, and it'll be well tracked. But you could see someone who wanted to take illegal product back into the system and by buying ours and basically swapping and things like that. So, but there's very hard to determine the actual product and the nature of it itself.
One of the questions is asking if there is a designation to know if it's correct product. When you buy a package of cigarettes, you can tell that's well, you should be able to tell whether that's a legal pack of cigarettes or not. Will you be able to tell because of a stamp on it or a band or some kind of branding?
There's it's been very late coming, but from a federal standpoint, there are packaging requirements that have to be consistent across any licensed producer in Canada. I'll tell you, with the amount that has to go on some of these packaging, when you get some of these small packages, like the 1 gram or 3.5 gram, my eyes are going and I can barely read what's on these bottles. They are bottles. They will tend to be medicinal type bottles in nature when you see them. Unfortunately, that means you can't see through to the product and see, certain cues of the product form itself. But it's a very regulated packaging environment and came fairly late to many of the producers from a federal standpoint. So they're really catching up right now to try to get those requirements, the appropriate requirements on them. From
a marketing standpoint, is there value in letting Canadians know, letting Nova Scotians know this is a locally grown product under these standards? Is it like when I go to buy my organic tomatoes? Is that the way the customer wants to interact with this product?
From a marketing perspective, on October 18th, the rules change big time. They become much more restrictive, leading up to, the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto right now is littered with $1 million billboards for Tweed, Aurora. They're all coming down on October 17th. So the ability to differentiate yourself from a marketing perspective in the traditional means isn't really available to LPs, unlike as it exists with alcohol. It's going to be more akin to tobacco and less like alcohol. But certainly getting your story out there, however you do it, whatever novel means you use to tell your story about organic or your growing methodologies or your craft nature or your rural location that's providing employment to the community, that the onus is on the individual producer to get that message out there. And there will be an excise stamp on legal products. And under the legislation, there was perhaps maybe security, but the biggest, most onerous part of the regulatory process for an aspiring LP was the record-keeping program, the seed-to-sale mechanics that need to be put in place. We've gone with the industry leader, Ample Organics, and we've done that because they are validated in the eyes of the government, and that's how the government's going to assure itself that it's going to manage to get that excise stamp on the products going out the door, because they're quite keen to collect those revenues.
I have two questions that are people are interested, and it has to do with what employees will know about products. So if I'm going in to the Sydney River store, and I am serving turkey, and I want a Chilean wine, I find the woman who knows everything there is to know about Chilean wine, and I ask her, and she recommends something. If I walk into the store and I say I'm having a party for 6 people, and none of them have used before, and none of us know how to do this, will somebody be able to answer those questions and recommend a product? Does it work the same as wine? And
yeah, I mean, we'll giggle along this one together, but so we hired either through transfers, outside hires. I have one of my folks in the corner over there who did over 250 interviews or so this summer. We've hired people for this dedicated cannabis space, and what I was really proud of is when we went to see our shareholder, the minister at the time, shortly after us being told that we were going to be the retailer of choice, I asked one simple question: can I do this the way the NSLC would do it? And I think many of us who grew up in Nova Scotia probably remember a little different NSLC 20, 30 years ago, and I hope you've seen the progress we've made on trying to make education and responsible use and making social occasions a little bit more enjoyable, and brought that forward. So when the answer was yes, do it the way I didn't have to put it in a back corner with beads and the old Blockbuster video area, and we were able to do it responsibly and having the appropriate controls that should be in place from a federal or provincial expectation, have a very strong CSR message. But as you might have heard in the media, there was certainly some conversation about our discovery guide. And a particular professor that I think was referenced earlier certainly had some concern with that. We worked with Health Canada since then, and you will have a tool at your disposal and our employees' disposal to guide you through the right decision. And the reason why I bring that up is I felt passionate that it was irresponsible for us not to do that. And that's how I positioned it. Dr. Strang, our Chief Medical Officer, has been involved and been an incredible partner in that. We've certainly attempted to balance it with some of the potential negative effects of cannabis as well, so not just tell the good side of the story and some things we don't know. But our employees have gone through tens of hours of training with a third-party expert in the field called LIFT. I've done it personally. Our employees know more than 99% of cannabis consumers in the world right now. Someone who smoked cannabis for 30 years probably doesn't know what they were smoking unless they were really engaged in it. And our employees will be ready to have those conversations with you and customers out there.
There is a question about the current Cannabis Act and the impact on First Nation interests in growth and distribution. And actually, I may ask you, and then I'll ask Dave because you're in the industry. What are you seeing?
I'd say a complicated one. So I certainly am not the person to answer it. But what I'll say is, First Nations community is something that our shareholder and the relationship take very serious, and we consult quite often with the beverage alcohol side and have some great partners in that space, but there's a lot to be figured out on the jurisdictional, I'll choose my words carefully, the jurisdictional rights and who ultimately has the ability to make that decision of who can produce and retail in line with the expectations of Health Canada's federal statutes around licensed producers and then retailing of it. So I think there's going to be some tests of that question over the next little while.
David, have you heard anything within the industry, within those who are working in your cohort about this?
There's certainly an expressed and public intention on the part of the government to assist Indigenous communities to get a piece of this new industry. And that's great. As a former lawyer who took an interest in Indigenous issues in law school and went on a few international mutes on the issue, I think it's absolutely intriguing. I can't wait to see what happens. There's constitutional arguments that I think will be made and are wildly likely to be successful. I think it could be a real game changer to some of the constitutional case law that exists in this country. And I see a very active participant from communities right across Canada in this industry.
I have quite a few questions I want to get through, and they're sort of not really thematically connected now. We're going to go back. There was lots, Patty, I'm going to send this to you. There was lots of mention of workplace accommodation for disclosed conditions, but the note goes on to say, accommodation must be reasonable to employer. It is not absolute. Will it require a Supreme Court of Canada decision to set standards for reasonable accommodation for cannabis, or are there, what precedents do you use when you use the phrase reasonable accommodations in a workplace environment?
It's an interesting question. I think when it comes to cannabis, the rules around accommodation are pretty clear. We mostly understand that we have to accommodate to the point of undue hardship, but when it gets to cannabis, it becomes a little bit more challenging because there's a misunderstanding about what that accommodation means. So There's, like I said earlier, there's the assumption that if you're using cannabis for medical purposes, then it's you can just use it wherever and you can smoke it at any time, which is not actually the case. You have to go back, I think, to the beginning of the accommodation process and really work through, first of all, what is the disability, and once you establish that there's a disability that requires accommodating to the point of undue hardship, then you need to work with an employee's physician to determine what the appropriate treatment for that is. And I think it becomes very challenging because when it comes to cannabis for medical purposes, there aren't a lot of physicians who have expertise in this area. So it's really challenging to determine whether or not the person has exhausted other forms of treatment. Is this the appropriate type of treatment? And if it is the appropriate type of treatment, when are they using it? How are they using it? Do they have to use it during the work day? Do they need to smoke it? Can they vape it? Can they use it in capsule form? There's a lot of questions that have to be answered through that accommodation process, but I would say that the process itself is the same as for any other type of accommodation. First, you establish that you need an accommodation, and then you have to look at it individually on a case-by-case basis to see what the person's needs are and what it means in the workplace and how you can meet the person's needs compared to the workplace. And another point to keep in mind, it's the same as any other accommodation. You may not be able to use the employee's ideal accommodation. So they may want to smoke in the middle of the day. That doesn't mean that you're obligated to accommodate that request. You can look at alternate forms of accommodation.
This is a question that has to do with terminology, and it says cannabis is consistently used as an envelope descriptive word. How are we expected to word policy when THC is not present?
Yeah, I mean, I'll default a little bit maybe to the side here. It is. I don't think there's any medical evidence or any public anything to the contrary that would suggest that a full CBD based product has any effects on impairment. And although it's very hard to get that product, it's not a lot of producers produce it, and it's in high demand. So I think it comes back to that word impairment. I'll look to any of my partners here, but it's really about cannabis being flipped out to whether it's anything that influences you into an impaired state.
There's a question about how this might impact tourism, which is I think it's a legitimate question.
My wife is the vice president of marketing for tourism, or for Discover Halifax, so we talk about this one a little bit. So we've looked at this with our partners. It's hard to look at the U.S. because there's only specific states that a few of them we've mentioned, and I've been to many times: Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, and different versions thereof. Now California, Nevada, etc. They have a tremendous amount of U.S.-based tourism that's coming across that border because of either novelty or desire. No one has an example, like I heard it mentioned Uruguay, and we both acknowledge, a third world country basically. No one knows what it means to come to a country that everywhere you can do it, right? So I often say, like, we will probably get our fair share, of tourism, like we do. If we get 5% of Canadian tourism today, do we get 5% of tourism based on cannabis today? Maybe. I think those who are connected to U.S. borders would maybe have a little bit of inclination to have a little bit of a greater fair share because of just access and ease. But I think there's something there. I don't know how big it would be today.
We only have a few minutes until Tim has to go, so I'm going to ask a couple more short snappers, and then I'm going to just allow you to chat with people amongst yourselves. But this is a really good question. Can each panelist present their favorite 2 positive outcomes from legalization? I'll give you a second to think about it. And while you're thinking about your 2 favorite positive outcomes, I'd just like to thank everybody for your questions. They're wonderful questions. And it certainly is, I'll pass them on to the Chamber just to let them know that there is still interest in this subject. But 2 positive outcomes from the legislation. How about, why don't I start with you, Peter?
None. No, just kidding. Actually, there's two. One, I think that it's regulated. I think that's a really good thing, because there's going to be controls put in place in relation to how it's grown, what fertilizer used, and it's going to be more safe. And hopefully, it's going to take it out of the hands of criminals and minimize the black market, which overall makes it more safe.
Scott, you're with Occupational Health and Safety. Two
Yeah,
positive outcomes.
The big positive for us is impairment has been in the workplace since the beginning of workplaces, right? And it's never gotten this much airtime. So we think it's great that people are now having these discussions about impairment in their workplace. Cannabis has been used in the workplace, and nobody was talking about it up until the last 18 months to 2 years. So it's a great conversation that's being had. And I don't know if my second point's a positive, but I really think, the good workplaces are going to remain good workplaces. If there's effective leadership, good policies and procedures, and good supervision and good employee relations, I really don't think that cannabis becoming legalized is going to have a major impact on those workplaces. Now, workplaces where there's challenges, there could become some serious issues, and it may drive some of these companies out of the marketplace, which I guess brings me to my positive point. I really think it's going to be a challenge for those workplaces that have a challenging culture.
David.
To the question you posed that elicited so much debate, I think the research that's going to start happening and the understanding of this product that's going to come from that is absolutely huge. And secondly is employment in rural Canadian communities. Under the legislation that's in place now, it changes after October 17th. There were different security requirements for facilities that were located outside of major cities. So in Nova Scotia, Halifax is considered a grade 2 security city. And if you're 75 kilometers outside of Halifax, the burden on you with respect to your vault and your cameras, et cetera, was significantly less. So there was an incentive in some ways, and distribution in others. It's a negative to be in rural Canada, but anything that drives employment in rural Canada is massive. And there is no industry, perhaps including oil and gas, that is investing as much as cannabis is in rural Canadian communities. If you look at the 3 producers we have licensed to produce but not sell, and so the NSLC is not to be blamed for not having Nova Scotia product on the shelves on October 17th. It is entrepreneurs in this province who have been slow to take up this new industry and call to arms, if you will. But we've got Liverpool, we've got Wentworth, we've got Antigonish, Truro's not far behind, and Kentville with Robinson's Cannabis. These are rural communities, and these companies are going to employ dozens and dozens of people at above competitive wage rates and salaries, because it's a job wherein the employee is surrounded by temptation at all sides, and you've got to remunerate and keep staff and avoid turnover in such sensitive industries, and that's great for our rural communities.
Tim, I know you have to catch a plane. Just very quickly, what do you see as the two?
Yeah, no, and just we're ready to sell local when they're ready to sell to us and allowed to. So we're really excited about that, because I do believe I think I can't say any better than what people have already said, but I will tie together that when it comes out of the black market and if it drives revenue, I hope we can get in a model that revenue is used to offset the harm and to get us further ahead from a research standpoint, and also invest into economic development. So a bit of hope to connect all those dots, and it doesn't just become as we know, over time, it can just become a line item that gets spent on different things. And I'm really hopeful of that as we bring it out of the reasoning that it started from, which was the black market. Because I think the safety part I'm a huge believer in as well, and I just hope that versus those who would consume it most and with time in their life isn't just a net offset to society. But I am, with 1 in 5 Canadians already, or Nova Scotians already consuming it, having them consistent, safe product, I think is something, responsibility that the government had to get in place. So.
Patty, what do you think?
I think I'm going to reiterate some of what was already said. I would see the benefits as regulation and research, and also education. Once the legislation is implemented And already, I guess, we're going to shift and focus on educating people around the use of cannabis and really focus on harm reduction. And I think that's going to be beneficial to have those conversations in the workplace. And also as a mother of young children, I hope that it will be very helpful to start those conversations with young people so that they understand the implications of using cannabis. And hopefully as they grow up, they make more informed choices.
And Guy, besides a few lawyers making a really good reputation for themselves on some of these cases, what are some of the positives on this?
I think decriminalization is a big one because I've seen a lot of people who have had possession of drugs over the years and they get charged and then they have the record, which is something that affects their ability to get passports, it affects job applications, etc. So the decriminalization, I think, is a major, major factor in this. And the quality control that will know the quality of the product that's coming out, because with a lot of the drugs that are being on the street now, you just don't know what's in them. So that's a major positive. Those two.
And actually, there's a note here that says, it actually answers the question, that says, given that 1 in 5 Nova Scotians already use, it is an opportunity for marginalized people who might feel less stigmatized. So that's another positive.
And if you look at the history in North America, it was at times used as a tool to potentially continue to marginalize some of those groups. And so I think that's a great point of getting us back on track and help back those groups.
I'm going to leave it here. We have a couple more minutes, but the guests are still available for a couple more minutes this afternoon. So if you have any questions that you would like to pass along to them individually, or maybe ask for some support or some resources, I'm sure these folks would be very happy to speak with you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I think it was a wonderful discussion. Thank you to our panelists.